In 1903, a young couple stood before a camera to capture the happiest day of their lives. The bride wore a delicate smile, the groom radiated pride and elegance. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. But decades later, when historians examined the photograph more closely, they discovered something that would transform this simple wedding portrait into one of history's most puzzling enigmas. A tiny symbol pinned to the groom's lapel, an emblem that shouldn't have existed at that time, foreshadowing a movement that wouldn't emerge until years later. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about early 20th century America. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. The morning of October 17th, 1903, dawned crisp and clear over the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut. Autumn leaves painted the streets in shades of amber and crimson, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Inside the modest Victorian home on Maple Street, 24-year-old Eleanor Hartford adjusted her ivory wedding dress for what must have been the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the delicate pearl buttons running down her spine, each one a tiny challenge to her nervous fingers. Eleanor's mother, Margaret, stood behind her, offering reassuring words while arranging the veil that had been passed down through 3 generations of Hartford women. The lace was yellowed with age but still beautiful, carrying with it the dreams and hopes of brides who had worn it before. Margaret's eyes glistened with tears she tried to hide, not wanting to worry her daughter on such an important day. Across town, in a boarding house near the railway station, 28-year-old Thomas Whitmore stood before a cracked mirror, carefully knotting his silk tie. Thomas had arrived in Millbrook only 18 months earlier, taking a position as an accountant at the local textile mill. He was a quiet man, methodical and precise in his work, with dark hair neatly parted and thoughtful grey eyes that seemed to observe everything around him with unusual intensity. Thomas's colleague and only close friend in town, Robert Chen, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, watching his friend prepare for the ceremony. Robert had emigrated from San Francisco 3 years prior, one of the few Chinese residents in this predominantly white New England town. Despite the prejudices of the era, Thomas had befriended him immediately upon his arrival, showing a progressive attitude that was rare for the time. "You're certain about this, Thomas?" Robert asked, his English still carrying the melodic accent of his Cantonese upbringing. "Marriage is a serious commitment." Thomas smiled, though there was something distant in his expression, as if his mind dwelled on matters beyond the present moment. "I've never been more certain of anything, Robert. Eleanor is exactly what I've been searching for." He reached into a small wooden box on the dresser and pulled out a silver pin, examining it carefully in the dim morning light. The emblem was roughly the size of a quarter, intricately designed with geometric patterns that seemed to form a larger symbol when viewed as a whole. Robert noticed it but said nothing, assuming it was simply a family heirloom or fraternal organization badge, common accessories for men of that era. Thomas carefully fastened the pin to his left lapel, adjusting it until it sat perfectly straight. He ran his fingers over its surface once more, as if drawing strength or reassurance from its presence, before turning to face his friend with renewed confidence. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the First Congregational Church, a white clapboard building with a modest steeple that dominated Millbrook's small town square. By 1:30, guests began arriving in their Sunday best, the women in high-collared dresses with elaborate hats, the men in dark suits and bowler hats. The church filled slowly with the 57 people who comprised the couple's combined social circle. Eleanor's extended family, colleagues from the textile mill, members of the church congregation, and a few of Thomas's acquaintances from his previous life in Boston. Reverend Samuel Morrison, a stern man in his 60s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a reputation for lengthy sermons, greeted each guest personally at the door. He had known Eleanor since her childhood and had initially harbored reservations about this outsider who had swept into town and captured the heart of one of Millbrook's most eligible young women. But Thomas had proven himself respectable, attending church services regularly and demonstrating the kind of moral character the Reverend valued. Eleanor arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, her father, William Hartford, walking beside her with visible pride. William owned the general store on Main Street and was well respected in the community, a position that made him protective of his only daughter's reputation and future happiness. As they processed down the aisle, Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Thomas stood at the altar, his posture perfect, his expression serene, yet deeply moved as he watched his bride approach. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the church's modest stained glass windows, casting patterns of colored light across the wooden pews and the faces of the assembled guests. Everything felt timeless, as if this moment existed outside the normal flow of hours and days. The ceremony proceeded according to tradition. Reverend Morrison delivered a shorter sermon than usual, focusing on the sacred bonds of matrimony and the responsibilities of husband and wife. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged their vows in clear, steady voices, slipping simple gold bands onto each other's fingers. When the Reverend finally pronounced them husband and wife, a collective sigh of satisfaction rippled through the congregation. After the ceremony, the wedding party moved to the Hartford family home for a modest reception. Margaret had spent days preparing food: roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, and a small but elegant cake decorated with sugar flowers. The guests mingled in the parlor and spilled out onto the front porch, discussing crops and weather and the recent news that the Wright brothers had successfully flown a powered aircraft in North Carolina. It was Eleanor's cousin, Frederick, who suggested they take a formal wedding photograph. Frederick had recently acquired one of the new Kodak cameras and was eager to demonstrate his photographic skills. The suggestion was met with enthusiasm, though formal photographs were still somewhat expensive and unusual for ordinary families in 1903. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me continue creating this content. Thomas and Eleanor posed in the front parlor, standing before the fireplace with its mantel decorated with family photographs and a small collection of Eleanor's mother's porcelain figurines. The afternoon light was perfect, streaming through the lace curtains and illuminating the couple without harsh shadows. Frederick adjusted his camera on its tripod, instructing them to remain perfectly still for the long exposure time required. Eleanor stood slightly to Thomas's left, her hand resting gently on his arm, her expression a mixture of joy and the solemnity that people of that era typically adopted for photographs. Thomas stood tall and proud, his left hand positioned naturally at his side, allowing a clear view of his wedding attire and the mysterious silver pin affixed to his lapel. The camera shutter clicked, capturing that single frozen moment in time. None of the people present that day could have imagined that this simple wedding photograph would, more than a century later, become the subject of intense historical scrutiny and endless speculation. The image would be examined and re-examined, analyzed with technology that didn't exist in 1903, and debated by experts who would struggle to explain what their eyes clearly showed them. As the reception continued into the evening, Thomas and Eleanor accepted congratulations and well wishes from their guests. Thomas seemed particularly attentive to his new bride, rarely leaving her side, speaking to her in low, gentle tones that made her blush and smile. To everyone present, they appeared to be exactly what they seemed, a young couple beginning their life together with all the hope and promise that marriage represented. Yet there were small details, barely noticeable at the time, that would later seem significant. The way Thomas's hand occasionally moved to touch the pin on his lapel, as if checking to ensure it remained in place. The brief, intense conversation he had with Robert Chen in the corner of the parlor, their voices too low for others to hear. The moment when Eleanor's father pulled Thomas aside, his expression serious, asking questions about Thomas's family background that the groom answered with practiced smoothness but curious vagueness. As twilight settled over Millbrook and the wedding guests began departing for their homes, Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore stood together on the front porch, watching the last traces of sunset fade from the western sky. Eleanor leaned against her new husband, exhausted but happy, already imagining the life they would build together. Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, his expression thoughtful as he gazed into the gathering darkness, perhaps contemplating secrets that Eleanor could never have suspected, mysteries that would remain hidden for generations to come. The early years of Thomas and Eleanor's marriage unfolded with the quiet predictability of small-town life in early 20th century America. They rented a modest two-story house on Chestnut Street, within walking distance of both the textile mill where Thomas worked and Eleanor's childhood home. The house had been built in the 1870s and carried the gentle wear of time, creaking floorboards, windows that rattled in strong winds, and a small back garden where Eleanor planted roses and vegetables each spring. Thomas proved to be a devoted husband by the standards of that era, though Eleanor sometimes noticed an emotional distance in him, as if part of his mind remained perpetually elsewhere. He left for work each morning at precisely 7 o'clock, carrying a leather satchel containing his ledgers and correspondence. He returned each evening at 6, washed his hands at the kitchen pump, and sat down to whatever meal Eleanor had prepared. After dinner, he would retreat to the small study they had set up in one of the upstairs rooms, where he claimed to work on mill accounts and personal correspondence. Eleanor rarely questioned her husband's habits. Women of her generation were taught to respect their husband's privacy and to focus their energies on maintaining a proper household. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, sewing, and visiting with her mother and the other married women of Millbrook. She attended church socials and charitable activities organized by the Ladies' Auxiliary. Her life followed the patterns expected of respectable married women in 1903, and she found contentment in this structured existence. Yet there were peculiarities that Eleanor couldn't entirely ignore, though she tried. Thomas received letters with unusual frequency, delivered by the Morning Post in plain envelopes with no return address. He read these letters in his study behind a closed door, and Eleanor never saw him leave them lying about the house. When she once asked about his correspondence, Thomas smiled and explained they were communications from colleagues in Boston regarding investment opportunities, a reasonable answer that somehow didn't entirely satisfy her. Thomas also made regular trips to Hartford, the state capital, claiming business with banking institutions there. These trips occurred monthly, always on the second Thursday, and he would leave early in the morning by train, returning late the same evening with a weariness that seemed to go beyond mere physical fatigue. Once, when Eleanor suggested she might accompany him to enjoy the city's shops, Thomas gently but firmly discouraged the idea, explaining that his business meetings left no time for leisure activities. Robert Chen remained Thomas's closest friend, and the two men spent considerable time together, sometimes meeting at the boarding house where Robert still lived, other times taking long walks through the woods that surrounded Millbrook. Eleanor liked Robert and appreciated his kindness, but she noticed that conversations between the two men often halted abruptly when she entered a room, resuming only after she had left. She told herself she was being foolish, that men simply had their own topics of discussion that didn't concern women, yet the feeling of exclusion lingered. In April of 1905, Eleanor announced she was expecting their first child. Thomas received the news with visible joy, embracing her with an emotion she had rarely seen him display so openly. For several weeks, he seemed more present, more engaged with their daily life together. He spoke enthusiastically about the future, about the child they would raise and the family they would build. Eleanor felt closer to him during this period than at any time since their wedding, but as her pregnancy progressed, Thomas's mysterious patterns resumed. The letters continued arriving, the monthly trips to Hartford continued without interruption, and new behaviors emerged that Eleanor found increasingly difficult to dismiss. She would wake in the night to find Thomas's side of the bed empty, discovering him standing at the window of their bedroom, staring out at the darkened street as if watching for something or someone. When she asked if he couldn't sleep, he would return to bed without directly answering, holding her gently but saying nothing. Their daughter, Margaret Rose, named after Eleanor's mother, was born on a snowy December morning in 1905. The birth was difficult, attended by the town's doctor and Eleanor's mother, lasting nearly 16 hours. Thomas paced anxiously in the parlor downstairs, and when he finally held his daughter for the first time, Eleanor saw tears in his eyes. Whatever secrets her husband kept, whatever mysteries surrounded him, Eleanor knew in that moment that he loved their child completely and genuinely. The years that followed brought a second daughter, Helen, born in 1908, and then a son, William, born in 1910. The Whitmore household grew livelier with children's voices, and Thomas seemed to find genuine happiness in fatherhood. He played with the children in ways unusual for men of that era, getting down on the floor to help them build block towers, reading them stories at bedtime, teaching them to identify birds and plants during weekend walks. Yet the enigmatic aspects of Thomas's life persisted and even intensified. In 1909, he traveled to New York City for what he described as an important business meeting, staying away for 3 full days. He returned looking haggard and troubled, though he assured Eleanor everything was fine. That same year, Eleanor discovered a newspaper clipping hidden in one of Thomas's books, an article about labor organizers and social reformers that had been carefully cut out and saved. When she asked about it, Thomas explained he was simply interested in current events, but his tone suggested the matter was closed to further discussion. The family's wedding photograph, taken by cousin Frederick in 1903, sat in a silver frame on the mantel in their parlor, a testament to the beginning of their life together. Eleanor often paused to look at it while dusting, remembering that perfect October day when everything seemed so clear and simple. She would study her own young face in the image, seeing the innocent hope in her eyes, then shift her gaze to Thomas, trying to read in his photographed expression some clue to the mysteries she sensed but couldn't articulate. The children grew, seasons changed, and Millbrook itself evolved slowly from a quiet agricultural community into a more industrialized town. The textile mill expanded, bringing new workers and new families to the area. An automobile appeared on Main Street in 1912, causing great excitement among the residents. The world beyond Millbrook was changing rapidly. News of labor strikes, women's suffrage movements, and growing tensions in Europe filtered into even this small Connecticut town. Thomas seemed to follow these developments with an intensity that Eleanor found both impressive and slightly unsettling. He subscribed to multiple newspapers and read them thoroughly each evening. He engaged in animated discussions with Robert Chen and a small circle of other men about politics and social reform. Eleanor sometimes overheard fragments of these conversations, talk of workers' rights, economic inequality, the need for systemic change, topics that seemed radical for their conservative community. In the summer of 1913, a stranger arrived in Millbrook asking questions about Thomas Whitmore. The man, who identified himself as a journalist researching successful New England businessmen, spoke with several townspeople before approaching Eleanor directly. He was polite but persistent, asking about Thomas's background, his activities, his associates. Eleanor answered as best she could, though she realized how little concrete information she actually possessed about her husband's life before Millbrook. When she mentioned the journalist's visit to Thomas that evening, his reaction was immediate and intense. His face paled, and he questioned her urgently about exactly what she had said, what the man had asked, where he had gone after speaking with her. Then, catching himself, he apologized for his sharp tone and explained that he was concerned about competitors at the mill trying to steal trade secrets. The explanation was plausible, but Eleanor felt a cold knot of anxiety forming in her stomach, Leave your comment about what you think of this story so far. That night, Thomas was again at the window watching the street. The next morning, he left the house unusually early, and Eleanor saw him speaking intensely with Robert Chen on the corner. Whatever was discussed, the journalist left town that same day and was never seen in Millbrook again. Eleanor wanted to demand answers, to insist that Thomas explain the shadows and secrets that clearly surrounded their life. But she was also afraid of what she might learn, afraid of disrupting the stability her children needed, afraid of challenging the social norms that dictated a wife's proper role and behavior. So she remained silent, attending to her household duties, raising her children, and trying to ignore the growing certainty that the man she had married in 1903 was not entirely who he appeared to be. The wedding photograph remained on the mantel, that frozen moment of happiness and hope. Eleanor didn't know, couldn't have known, that decades later, historians would examine that same image with magnifying glasses and sophisticated technology, focusing not on the bride's face or the couple's expressions, but on the small silver pin attached to Thomas Whitmore's lapel, a pin that would become the center of one of history's most intriguing mysteries, raising questions that would never be fully answered. The Whitmore family photograph sat untouched in a dusty cardboard box for nearly 60 years. After Eleanor's death in 1954, followed by Thomas's passing just 3 months later, some said from heartbreak, though others noted he had been in declining health for years. Their belongings were distributed among their 3 surviving children. Margaret Rose, the eldest daughter, received several boxes of family photographs and documents, which she stored in her attic in Hartford without examining them closely. She had her own life, her own family, and the past seemed less important than the rapidly changing present of mid-20th century America. It was Margaret Rose's granddaughter, Jennifer Whitmore, who would inadvertently trigger the mystery that would captivate historians and amateur researchers for generations to come. In 2018, Jennifer was helping her grandmother downsize from the large Hartford house to a smaller, assisted living apartment. The attic yielded decades of accumulated possessions, and among them were those boxes of photographs that had sat undisturbed since 1954. Jennifer, a graduate student in history at Yale University, immediately recognized the historical value of early 20th century photographs. She carefully sorted through the images, finding everything from formal portraits to casual snapshots, documenting the Whitmore family's life from 1903 through the 1940s. The wedding photograph, still in its tarnished silver frame, caught her attention immediately. Not because of anything unusual she initially noticed, but simply because it was beautifully composed and remarkably well preserved. She posted the image on her social media account with a caption about discovering her great-great-grandparents' wedding photo from 1903, thinking a few history enthusiasts might find it interesting. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. Within days, it had gone viral, attracting attention from historians, journalists, and countless curious internet users. But the interest wasn't focused on the couple's story or the aesthetics of early 20th century photography. Everyone was talking about the pin on Thomas Whitmore's lapel. Dr. Robert Morrison, a professor of American history at Columbia University, was among the first experts to contact Jennifer. His message was polite but urgent. Could he examine the original photograph? He explained that the symbol visible on her great-great-grandfather's lapel appeared to match emblems associated with certain political movements that shouldn't have existed in 1903. Jennifer agreed to meet Dr. Morrison at his office in New York City, bringing the original photograph carefully wrapped in protective materials. Morrison examined it under bright light with a magnifying glass, then used a high-resolution scanner to create detailed digital images that could be enhanced and analyzed further. His initial assessment was both fascinating and troubling. This symbol, Morrison explained, pointing to the pin in the enhanced digital image, bears remarkable similarity to emblems used by socialist and labor movements that didn't organize formally until several years after this photograph was taken. Look at these intersecting geometric patterns. They match designs that appeared in radical political publications starting around 1910, but not before. Jennifer studied the image closely. The pin was clearly visible in the photograph, roughly an inch in diameter, featuring intricate geometric patterns that formed what appeared to be an abstract representation of industrial machinery surrounded by interconnected shapes that might symbolize workers or community. Could it be a coincidence? Jennifer asked. Maybe it was just a decorative pin that happened to look similar to later political symbols. Morrison shook his head slowly. That would be an extraordinary coincidence. These weren't arbitrary designs. They were carefully created to represent specific ideological concepts. And there's another problem. He pulled up several other images on his computer screen, showing various emblems and pins from the early 1900s. Based on manufacturing techniques visible in the detail of this photograph, this pin was made using methods that weren't common until at least 1908 or 1909. The level of detail, the apparent quality of the metalwork, it's inconsistent with typical lapel pins from 1903. The discovery sparked intense debate in academic circles. Dr. Morrison published a preliminary paper titled Anachronistic Iconography in Early 20th Century Photography, The Whitmore Wedding Mystery, which was picked up by several history journals and popular media outlets. Other historians joined the investigation, each bringing different expertise and perspectives. Dr. Patricia Chen, a specialist in labor history at Berkeley, argued that Thomas Whitmore might have been involved in early, undocumented labor organizing efforts. We know that socialist and labor movements had informal networks operating before their formal organization, she wrote in a response paper. It's possible that Whitmore was part of a secret or semi-secret group that used symbols which only later became public and widespread. This theory led researchers to investigate Thomas Whitmore's background more thoroughly. Jennifer worked with genealogists and historians to trace her great-great-grandfather's history. They discovered that before arriving in Millbrook in 1902, Thomas had lived in Boston, where he worked as an accountant at a shipping company. Before Boston, his trail became murky. Birth records indicated he was born in New York City in 1875, but details about his childhood and early adult years were frustratingly sparse. More intriguingly, researchers discovered that several of Thomas's associates in Millbrook had their own mysterious backgrounds. Robert Chen, his closest friend, had been involved in labor organizing efforts in San Francisco before moving to Connecticut, a fact that seemed insignificant at the time, but now appeared potentially meaningful. A man named Frederick Stoltz, who had briefly lived in Millbrook between 1904 and 1906, turned out to have been arrested in 1912 for participating in labor protests in Pennsylvania. As the investigation continued, Jennifer spent countless hours reading through her great-great-grandparents' papers, letters, and documents. Most of it was mundane: household accounts, children's school records, correspondence with family members. But there were gaps and peculiarities. Several years of Thomas's life showed almost no documentation. There were letters with portions carefully cut out, leaving incomplete messages that suggested someone had deliberately removed sensitive information. Eleanor's diary, which Jennifer discovered in one of the boxes, provided tantalizing hints without concrete answers. Eleanor rarely wrote about anything controversial or deeply personal, adhering to the modest conventions of her era. But there were entries that suggested she suspected her husband of harboring secrets. One entry from 1909 read, "Thomas received another of those plain letters today. He read it quickly and then burned it in the fireplace. When I asked if everything was well, he assured me it was merely business correspondence, but his hands shook slightly as he fed the pages to the flames. I wonder sometimes what burdens he carries that he cannot share with me. Another entry from 1913. A strange man came asking questions about Thomas today. Afterward, Thomas was deeply unsettled, though he tried to hide it. I feel sometimes that I am married to only half a person, that the other half exists in some world I cannot see or understand. The mystery attracted attention from less scholarly sources as well. Conspiracy theorists proposed wild explanations, that Thomas Whitmore was a time traveler, that the photograph had been doctored, that he was involved in secret government programs. These theories were easily dismissed by serious researchers, but they contributed to the growing public fascination with the case. If you're finding this mystery as intriguing as we are, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion. Forensic photograph analysts were brought in to examine the image for any signs of manipulation or alteration. Using techniques that could detect even subtle evidence of retouching or compositional changes, they confirmed that the photograph appeared to be completely authentic, with no signs of the pin having been added or modified after the original image was captured in 1903. Materials scientists attempted to determine what the pin might have been made from based on its appearance in the photograph. While they couldn't be entirely certain without the actual object, the reflective properties and apparent texture suggested it was likely silver or a similar metal alloy, consistent with quality jewelry or emblematic pins of that era. But perhaps the most significant development came when Dr. Morrison's team discovered a reference to Thomas Whitmore in an obscure collection of correspondence held at a small historical society in Massachusetts. The letters, written by a political activist named Samuel Breckner in 1911, mentioned Thomas W. of Connecticut as someone who had been working for the cause since before most of us knew the cause existed. The letters didn't provide details about what the cause was, but the timing and context strongly suggested involvement in early labor or socialist organizing. Jennifer attempted to learn what had happened to the pin itself. She contacted elderly relatives, searched through remaining family possessions, and even visited her great-great-grandparents' old house in Millbrook, now owned by strangers who knew nothing of its history. The pin had vanished completely, leaving only its image in that single photograph as evidence of its existence. The historical investigation revealed that Thomas Whitmore had lived a long, seemingly ordinary life, working at the textile mill until his retirement in 1935, raising his 3 children successfully and becoming a respected member of the Millbrook community. He never ran for office, never published political writings, never appeared in records of labor protests or radical organizations. If he had been involved in early political movements, he had been extraordinarily careful to keep that involvement hidden. The mystery deepened rather than resolved. Every answer raised new questions. Every document discovered added layers of ambiguity rather than clarity. And at the center of it all remained that single photograph from October 17, 1903, with its inexplicable symbol that seemed to exist impossibly outside the proper flow of historical time. The investigation into the Whitmore wedding photograph became a phenomenon that extended far beyond academic circles. By early 2019, the image had been featured in documentaries, discussed on popular podcasts, and analyzed in countless articles and blog posts. The photograph itself became iconic, reproduced so many times that its stark black and white composition, the young couple standing proudly in their wedding attire, the mysterious pin visible on the groom's lapel, was recognizable to millions of people who had never heard of Millbrook, Connecticut, or the Whitmore family. Jennifer Whitmore found herself at the center of a media storm she had never anticipated. She gave interviews to newspapers, appeared on television programs, and spoke at historical conferences about her great-great-grandfather, and the mystery surrounding him. She approached the attention with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, caught between her natural scholarly interest in historical puzzles and the strange feeling of having her family's private history become public property. The research continued, expanding in multiple directions simultaneously. Dr. Morrison assembled a team of graduate students to conduct a comprehensive investigation of early 20th century political movements in New England, looking for any documentation that might mention Thomas Whitmore or similar symbols. They combed through archives, examined old newspapers, studied photographs of labor rallies and political gatherings from the 1900s and 1910s, searching for any other appearance of the mysterious emblem. Their search revealed something both intriguing and frustrating. While they found no exact matches to the symbol in Thomas's lapel pin, they discovered several similar designs that shared common elements. Geometric patterns meant to represent industrial machinery, interconnected shapes suggesting solidarity and collective action. These symbols appeared in various forms across different movements and time periods, suggesting that perhaps the imagery wasn't as unique as initially thought, or that there was a shared visual language among early political reformers that historians hadn't previously recognized. Dr. Chen's research into labor history took a different approach. She investigated the economic and social conditions of textile mill workers in early 1900s Connecticut, looking for evidence of organizing efforts that might have been suppressed or gone undocumented. Her work revealed that while there were no major strikes or public protests in Millbrook during Thomas Whitmore's years there, similar towns in the region had experienced significant labor unrest, much of it organized by small groups of activists who worked secretly to avoid employer retaliation and legal prosecution. What we're dealing with, Dr. Chen explained in a lecture at Berkeley, is the challenge of documenting resistance movements that deliberately avoided documentation. These early organizers knew they were engaging in activities that could cost them their jobs, their social standing, even their freedom. They operated in shadows, used coded language, and destroyed evidence of their activities. The absence of records proving Thomas Whitmore's involvement doesn't mean he wasn't involved. It might actually suggest the opposite. This interpretation gained traction among many historians. It fit with what was known about early labor organizing, explained the mysterious letters and secretive behavior Eleanor had noted in her diary, and accounted for Thomas's apparent connections to people like Robert Chen and Frederick Stoltz, who were later documented activists. The theory positioned Thomas Whitmore as a kind of hidden hero, a man who risked his comfortable life and social position to work towards social justice, who wore his commitment openly but disguised as mere decoration, visible only to those who understood its meaning. But not everyone found this explanation satisfying. Skeptics pointed out that it relied heavily on speculation and circumstantial evidence. There were no documents proving Thomas had participated in organizing activities, no testimony from people who had worked with him, no writings in his own hand expressing political beliefs. The pin remained the only concrete evidence, and without the physical object to examine, even that evidence was limited to a single photographic image. Dr. William Foster, a historian at Harvard who specialized in photographic authentication and analysis, proposed an alternative explanation. In a controversial paper, he suggested that the photograph might have been taken at a different time than claimed, or that the pin might have been a later addition to Thomas's wedding attire that was photographed separately and misattributed to the 1903 wedding. We're assuming the photograph's date is accurate based on family records and the apparent age of the subjects, Foster wrote. But what if the image we're looking at was actually taken later, perhaps in 1910 or 1911, and was simply identified incorrectly when it was passed down through the family? This would resolve the anachronism entirely. Jennifer and other researchers pushed back against this theory. pointing to Eleanor's diary entries that specifically mentioned the wedding photograph being taken by her cousin Frederick on their wedding day. Moreover, other photographs from the same event showed the same clothing and setting, and Eleanor appeared noticeably pregnant in photographs that were definitively dated to 1905, making her appear much younger in the wedding photograph by comparison. The debate became increasingly technical and specialized, but the public fascination never waned. Part of the enduring appeal was the human story behind the mystery. Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore weren't famous historical figures or important politicians. They were ordinary people, living ordinary lives. A mill accountant and his wife raising their children in a small Connecticut town. Yet somehow, their wedding photograph had become a portal into questions about hidden histories, secret resistances, and the ways that ordinary people participate in extraordinary movements without leaving clear traces for future generations to follow. Jennifer continued her personal investigation, driven by a desire to understand who her great-great-grandfather really was. She traveled to Boston, visiting archives and libraries, trying to find records from Thomas's years there before he moved to Millbrook. She discovered that the shipping company where he had worked had gone bankrupt in 1920, and most of its records had been destroyed. She found his name on a roster of employees from 1900, but nothing that revealed his activities or associations during that period. In the attic of her grandmother's apartment, Jennifer made one more significant discovery, a small notebook that had belonged to Thomas, filled with what appeared to be accounting notes and business calculations. But on the final pages, written in a different, more careful hand, were several passages that seemed more personal. One passage read, "A man must decide whether to live comfortably with injustice or uncomfortably in pursuit of justice. I have made my choice, though it means carrying secrets that create distance between myself and those I love most. I pray that someday Eleanor and the children will understand, or if they cannot understand, that they will at least know I acted according to my conscience." D. Another passage. "The symbol I wear is small enough to go unnoticed by most, significant enough to be recognized by those who share our vision. It is both a declaration and a disguise, visible and invisible simultaneously. Perhaps that is the nature of all meaningful resistance. It must be present and absent, loud and silent, open and hidden." These passages seem to confirm the theory that Thomas had been involved in some form of political activism, that the pin had been deliberately chosen for its symbolic meaning. Yet they still provided no concrete details about what organization he belonged to, what specific actions he took, or how deep his involvement went. The mystery attracted attention from beyond the academic and historical communities. Artists created works inspired by the photograph, paintings, sculptures, installations that explored themes of hidden identity and secret resistance. Writers crafted stories imagining Thomas Whitmore's untold experiences. The image became a kind of Rorschach test, with people projecting onto it their own beliefs about history, justice, and the nature of heroism. Some saw Thomas as a brave activist, working secretly to improve workers' lives. Others viewed him as a potentially dangerous radical who deceived his family and community. Still others believed the entire mystery was overblown, that the pin was simply an unusual piece of jewelry with no political significance, and that historians and the public were reading meanings into it that had never existed. In 2021, the photograph was exhibited at the Smithsonian as part of a special display on American Mysteries, Unsolved Questions in Our History. Visitors stood before the enlarged image, studying the pin's details, reading about the investigation and the various theories. Many left comments in a guest book expressing their own thoughts about what the mystery meant and why it mattered. "This photograph reminds us," one visitor wrote, "that every person has depths we cannot see. Every family history has chapters that remain closed. Every generation leaves questions for those who come after." Jennifer completed her doctoral dissertation on the Whitmore photograph and its place in historical methodology, exploring how historians deal with evidence that seems to contradict accepted timelines and how mysteries can sometimes teach us more than solutions. She concluded her dissertation by acknowledging that the central questions might never be answered definitively. "We may never know with certainty what the pin represented," she wrote, or how Thomas Whitmore came to wear it on his wedding day in 1903. But the photograph itself is real. The pin existed. Thomas wore it openly in a formal portrait meant to commemorate one of the most important days of his life. These facts are undeniable, even if their meaning remains elusive. The investigation gradually quieted as researchers moved on to other projects and media attention shifted to newer mysteries. But the photograph never entirely disappeared from public consciousness. It continued to circulate online, to be referenced in books and articles, to serve as an example in discussions about historical interpretation and the limits of evidence. Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore's descendants scattered across the country, building their own lives and families, carrying with them this strange legacy of an ancestor whose wedding photograph became famous for reasons no one could fully explain. Some embraced the mystery with pride, telling their children and grandchildren about the great-great-grandfather who might have been a secret hero. Others preferred to see him as simply a good man who lived a quiet life, the mystery being nothing more than a curious historical coincidence. The pin itself was never found. Searches of estate sales, antique shops, and museum collections turned up nothing. If it still exists somewhere, it remains as hidden as Thomas's full story, as elusive as the truth behind that October day in 1903, when a young couple stood before a camera and unknowingly created one of history's most intriguing puzzles. The photograph still hangs in Jennifer's office at Yale, a constant reminder of how much of history happens in the spaces between documented facts, in the silences between recorded words. Thomas Whitmore gazes out from that frozen moment in time, his expression serene, his mysterious pin displayed openly for anyone to see, and yet revealing nothing to those who weren't meant to understand its significance. Perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps Thomas intended the symbol to be exactly what it became, visible to everyone, but legible only to a select few, a silent declaration of beliefs he couldn't express openly, a small act of defiance or solidarity that existed simultaneously in the open and in hiding. Or perhaps we're reading too much into a simple piece of jewelry, transforming an ordinary man into a figure of mystery, because we want to believe that beneath the surface of conventional lives lie depths of courage and conviction. Perhaps the pin was simply a pin, its resemblance to later political symbols nothing more than coincidence, and Thomas Whitmore was exactly what he appeared to be: a conscientious accountant, a devoted husband and father, a man who lived his life honorably, but without particular drama or secret purpose. The truth, as Eleanor might have understood better than anyone, is that we rarely know even the people closest to us as completely as we imagine. Every person remains partially mysterious, their inner lives and private thoughts forever beyond full comprehension. Thomas kept his secrets, whatever they were, and carried them to his grave. Eleanor loved him despite, or perhaps because of, the parts of him she couldn't entirely know. And now, more than a century later, we're left with a photograph, a mystery, and the endless human compulsion to find meaning in the fragments of the past. The answer, if there ever was one simple answer, remains lost in time. What endures is the question itself, and the reminder that history is built not just from facts we can document, but from all the untold stories, hidden actions, and quiet resistances that leave only the faintest traces. A cryptic passage in a diary, a friend's knowing silence, a small silver pin worn openly on a wedding day in 1903. If you enjoyed this mystery, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and theories about what the pin really meant and who Thomas Whitmore truly was. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos exploring more historical mysteries and untold stories.